So the point has been made that now the hard part starts. Of course, the negotiation's very difficult, very complex, but talk us through what the rebuilding looks like and guaranteeing that this agreement will last and be sustainable.
Well, just to be fair, Katie, what was accomplished was also difficult. Nothing in the Middle East is easy. And there's a lot of credit to go around just to get us to this point. And there's reasons to celebrate, obviously. But that said, you're right. I'm not fighting your basic point. Certainly the harder part is to come. One is to make sure the ceasefire holds. There's questions about the role of Hamas and how does one try to promote disarmament? What does one do to get enough food into the area? How does one create security in the area? What about governance for the area and so forth and so on? And that doesn't even get to questions about the future political process between Israelis and Palestinians. So there's any number of difficult challenges, but the most basic is to create conditions of order, of stability. And that at least creates an environment in which you can begin to address humanitarian issues, economic rebuilding, political governance, and so forth. That is the prerequisite, stability and order for all else.
Well, I guess to that point, and you list a number of potential issues here, potential questions when it comes to disarmament, governance, rebuilding, the list goes on. But when it comes to enforcement, I mean, what do you think that the administration, the Trump administration, is prepared to do here?
Well, the critical part of enforcement would probably come from this international or Arab stabilization force. And it is going to have to be militarily capable because you can't assume you have a permissive peacekeeping kind of environment. There are likely to be challenges, whether it's from Hamas or some other group that or individual that is there. So that is, I would think that is the most basic. You can also try to make economic help contingent on certain types of behavior. If Israel wants to respond to some type of incident, you may want to say, look, that doesn't cross a threshold, hold back for now. So I think there's things you can do to incentivize certain kinds of behavior. But the most important thing is putting into place an international force that has enough capability to deter armed attacks, and if and when deterrence doesn't work, to respond to them decisively.
Today is a day when I think a lot of President Trump's critics have come out and given him credit for this. Really a monumental achievement, an historic achievement, as we've been saying all day. Certainly the freeing of the remaining hostages by itself is a pretty amazing feat. And he credits, you know, not only his team, but his sort of art of the deal, his negotiation style, which is, you know, not typical of a U.S. president. Do you think that that's a huge part of this, a big part of this, Richard? And can he use that now to solve the Russia-Ukraine war?
Look, he does deserve credit, but also he was able to operate in a context that was conducive to diplomacy. Hamas had been militarily weakened, as had Iran, its principal military benefactor. Iran is also economically in dire straits. The Arab countries wanted the situation to settle down. And then he was in a position to put pressure on Israel. But again, none of this should diminish the fact that the president did an interesting thing. Rather than waiting for every I to be dotted and T to be crossed, he essentially said, we've got a deal. Don't you now get in the way of it by raising this or that question. So I think he put some very effective leverage on both the Israelis and on Hamas, and has succeeded. I think the fair question is whether such an approach will succeed going forward. One can hope. I just think that history leads you to be somewhat more sober about it.
Speaking of leverage, J.D. Vance was on the Sunday talk shows, or on Fox, I believe, yesterday, saying that the president has more cards in this much colder, thankfully, war between the U.S. And China, a trade war. On the other hand, Meredith Whitney was out yesterday with a note pointing out that China's Ministry of Commerce has said it will ban any export of critical minerals to the U.S. for military purposes. And she points out, at least as far as she knows, that a lot of those big defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, may be almost out of critical minerals. And some, like GE and Fluor, are depleted completely. How serious is this issue?
It is a serious issue. My basic point would be both the United States and China are in a position to hurt one another. We don't want to see mutual assured destruction here. But the United States has allowed itself to get into a situation where its dependence upon Chinese rare earths and certain components is truly unhealthy. And that is something that will take time to address, time to reduce. But in the meantime, yes, China has significant leverage. We have some leverage over China in various ways in terms of technology transfers and so forth. Again, you've got the meeting between the President Xi Jinping and President Trump scheduled in a few weeks from now, potentially a summit sometime in the first half of next year in China. To me, the question is whether they can work out an economic relationship that makes economic sense and takes into account the military realities. I think it's possible, but it's not going to be easy. And I think we saw that what happened Friday, even though today we've seen both sides pull back a little bit from the brink.
What's interesting when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, where negotiations have progressed to, or talks, whatever you want to call it, is that it feels like it's the non-tariff issues that have really taken center stage. We're talking about rare earths, of course. That seems like a very urgent part of this conversation. How do you think tariffs and the threat of more tariffs filter in here? We were talking to Jeff Moon on Friday. He's the former USTR under the Obama White House. His view is that they will be limited and ineffective, and I wonder if you share that view.
I tend to, because China has lots of ways of pushing back. We've seen it again with rare earths, certain things in supply chains. Also, China will be able, at least in part, to find alternative markets to the United States. One other factor also, which is going to come into all this, is going to be geopolitics. Economics don't take place in a vacuum. There's questions of the South China Sea, even more acutely questions about Taiwan. So when the two presidents get together, either in Seoul or next year in China, if the summit were to happen, it turns out to be a really big agenda, both economics and non-economics. And one of the questions is, are there any trade-offs between the two, or do economics get dealt with in their lane and geopolitics in its lane?
What's also interesting when you think about, how things are progressing with the U.S.-China relationship, I remember a few months ago, the Chinese side made it clear that they wanted basically delegates to come in and negotiate these trade issues. They didn't want the two leaders, President Xi and President Trump, to be in conversation with each other. But it feels like that is the main channel of communication. Of course, it's not the only channel. We know that they have teams on either sides. But it seems like there's so much focus on this meeting between these two leaders, whether or not they're going to meet in a week and a half. And that isn't necessarily how the Chinese wanted this conversation to happen.
Well, I'm not sure either president, I don't mean this as disrespect, is in a position to negotiate details about tariffs or export controls. Some of the most complicated meetings I ever sat in when I was in government dealt with export controls and technologies. And so I think that's too much to expect them to deal with. I think their job is to deal, if you will, with the big basic issues. And that's why you have, aides and staff to deal with all the details, whether it's tariffs, export controls, or anything else on the economic side. But they're going to have to set the parameters. And again, they're going to have to decide whether there's any trade-offs between economic issues and geopolitical issues. And I think that could be ultimately one of the really big questions to be decided either later this month or next year.
I want to finally ask Richard about Argentina. Javier Milei is coming to the White House tomorrow. And of course, you've had Secretary Bessent say he wants to guarantee Argentina's currency with, I think, an additional $20 billion. Seems like they'll go through that pretty quickly if the market doesn't believe it. What's your read on the situation?
Well, I tend to agree. And the real question to me is, if you're going to guarantee something, what are the conditions? What is it we want from Argentina when it comes to economic policy, maybe even non-economic policies? We have leverage here. So the question is, what do we get for it? But to have an unconditional guarantee makes very little sense unless you think all they need is some financial help to get over some type of an obstacle. I don't see it that way. So I would think we ought to be linking it to all sorts of policy changes, which, by the way, would be in our interest and Argentina's as well.